everybody. Welcome to tonight's lecture. I'm Dan Schwartz. I'm the director of the Clean Energy Institute at UW and a professor of chemical engineering. Thanks for joining us for this final lecture of the series for 2018. This series is presented as a partnership between the College of Engineering and the UW Alumni Association. If you're not a member, I encourage you to go visit their website at uwalum.com and learn more about the benefits of membership. I think we all recognize that hurricanes are long felt and important, devastating disasters in the United States. In 2017, just a little over a year ago, Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico and left more than 3 million people in the dark without power or any of the benefits that come from it. It was months before many people got their power back. Our speaker tonight, Lilo Pozzo, wanted to help in the aftermath of the storm. In November 2017, she brought a team of students and researchers to a rural community in Puerto Rico to provide emergency power. Lilo is the Weyerhaeuser Endowed Associate Professor of Chemical Engineering. And in her research, she applies nanotechnology to problems in clean energy and health. She also leads an entrepreneurial education program in the Department of Chemical Engineering, and with her students has co-founded several technology ventures. She's also the leader of the Hurricane Maria Energy and Health Project, an interdisciplinary field study project that you're going to learn more about tonight. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Leo.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you and tell you a little bit about what we've been actually doing together with a group of interdisciplinary students and faculty from throughout the College of Engineering, but also beyond that. So let's start with where is Puerto Rico located. If you haven't checked your maps lately, it's this small island right off very close to the Dominican Republic and not too far from the United States. So I actually grew up there. So this is a picture of my family. We grew up in San Juan, which is the capital of Puerto Rico. And I've always had connections with the island. My wife, who's sitting in the audience, is from the town of Weyerhaeuser, which is in the center of the island, where it's more mountainous and remote and rural. And we both went to college and met there at the University of Puerto Rico, Maya West campus, where we both studied chemical engineering. So if you live in Puerto Rico, you're used to hurricanes because they're a thing of the island. They come with living in paradise, if we want to say. So here's IR satellite images of Hurricane Hugo, which was my first experience with hurricanes shortly after we moved to the island. So this was when I was very young. And if you actually look closely to the satellite images, you'll notice that Hugo actually barely passed through the island. So it actually didn't create that much power. That was my first experience. The second experience was with Hurricane Georges that actually happened while we were in college. And Georges actually crossed right through the island and left a lot of rain, a lot of issues. Both of these were Category 3 hurricanes, which is directly proportional to the wind speed of the hurricanes. So how is it like to experience hurricanes if you're growing up in Puerto Rico? Well, there's preparations first, right? So you have to stock up on canned foods. If you're from Puerto Rico, you'll recognize Chef Boyardee. That's a favorite with kids. You have to secure the outside, so pick up anything that might become a projectile. Try to clean up the yard, put your cars inside in a place that is protected. And we add tormenteras, which are these coverings to windows to protect them from flying objects and things that could actually break them. During the hurricane, you can expect that you'll lose power, especially in Puerto Rico. So it'll be dark, but it'll be cozy because you'll be with your closest family members and friends. You might spend time playing games in the dark, while the winds, right, obviously are very scary and very loud, and you might hear transformers also breaking up as you lose power. And then right after the hurricane, well, you assess the damage, you go out and you look at what actually happened, maybe pick up some of the debris and start cutting trees that might have fallen down. Then you have this massive cookout, right? Because you have all these things in your fridge that need to be used up. Typically what we do is we make a big sancocho. So that's Jose Andres, chef that actually played services in Puerto Rico, making a sancocho for distribution. And you also learn to live with minimal water. And that's, for those that have been through hurricanes, you recognize why I showed the toilet. That was my experience. That's not everybody's experience, right? This is also the damage that happened during Hurricane Georges. Lots of flooding, right? So there were many families that were completely, their lives were completely destroyed because of losing their houses and all their possessions. Houses that were made out of wood also were significantly destroyed in the hurricanes. So this makes me think of how privileged my situation was growing up as a middle-class family in Puerto Rico. We had a house that was kind of like a bunker. It was made of concrete. There was no risk that the roof would actually fly off. That's not the true for everybody else living in the island. I also lived in the capital of San Juan, where we had access to food, water. We could run to the stores. We also had a fast recovery of electricity compared to many of the other locations in the island. Here's a picture of what happened right after Hurricane Maria in a town called Utuado, which is more rural, very close to Jayuya, where Marvy, my wife, grew up. This community was completely cut off because the only bridge that actually was used to connect them to the mainland was actually completely damaged during the hurricane. During Georges, my wife's family actually had to cross a river not too dissimilar from this one in order to make it to the town. So you can see how people are privileged and everybody's experience is different. More importantly for this talk, no one in my house was ill. So we didn't have to worry about basic services that we needed to provide to them. So what happened last year? Well, last year, early September, September 5th, this is what was actually projected for Puerto Rico. This massive hurricane called Irma was threatening the island. It had 170-mile-an-hour winds, and it was Category 5. Everybody thought this is going to be devastating to the island. So the government rapidly prepared, and they were actually applauded for their response and for their preparations. Fortunately, Irma veered off north also, kind of like Hugo did, so it didn't actually create a lot of damage in Puerto Rico. However, it devastated the smaller Antilles. This is a picture of St. Martin, a place I had vacationed many times before, and you can see that the level of destruction was actually huge. Puerto Ricans are very generous people, so once they realized that the damage in Puerto Rico, the mainland, wasn't actually that hard, they quickly organized to help the people in the smaller Antilles, and this is a picture of the Puerto Ricans gathering donations into private boats to take them to the Virgin Islands, where the devastation from the hurricane was huge. However, less than 2 weeks after that, another hurricane would threaten the island, and this was Maria. It was a little bit less intense than Irma, 150 miles an hour, but it was still Category 5, so this was a major hurricane. Remember, the two previous experiences I had were with much smaller hurricanes. So Maria also had a projection to go right through the island, but because this was just 2 weeks before they had also had the same warnings in Puerto Rico for Hurricane Irma, people were a little bit less cautious and, in their preparations. However, Maria did actually cross right through the island, so it entered around the area of Yabucoa, and it actually crossed through the center, Jayuya included, where my wife actually grew up. So these are the hurricane trajectories of all the 3 storms that I discussed earlier. So this is a picture of the devastation in Puerto Rico, and this was all throughout the island. So you can see that, again, the wooden houses are completely damaged, many of them left without roofs, all of the possessions of these citizens completely destroyed. The hurricane also devastated the power grid, right? So here's a picture of the town of Caguas, which is not too far from the capital, San Juan. So this is a major city. And you can see that the heat map shows the lighting that you would essentially sense through satellite imagery before the hurricane, after the hurricane, and even 13 days after the hurricane, barely any lights had actually been recovered. So here's a plot from data from the Department of Energy of the recovery of electricity in the island of Puerto Rico through time. And actually, you can even see the effects of Irma, where the electrical grid was also lost, but the recovery was much faster. This was because the devastation was very, very limited. However, with Maria, it would take months, up to 8 months in many places to actually recover electricity. Similarly, the communications was also completely cut off. Communication nowadays is mostly through essentially signals like cellular signals and so on, and they need to be powered. And these are remote antennas that need to actually be connected to the grid or fed up with emergency generators to actually work. So how was it to experience a hurricane from afar, from the diaspora, when you still have half of your family living in Puerto Rico? Well, first off is that because we didn't have any communication, there was barely any news coming out into the Seattle area, other than what you would actually hear from social media or from the news agencies that were mostly reporting from San Juan, the capital. When we did hear something, right, it was usually tragic. There were limited resources, no fuel was available. So even those that had generators couldn't actually power them because there was no fuel anywhere in the island. We wouldn't hear from our family for up to a week. So we were desperate and we didn't know what was actually going on. We could see images like this of people riding on the streets requesting help, especially in this case, it's actually water and food. So like many Puerto Ricans in the Seattle area, we felt like we needed to do something. And the most logical thing when you hear that there's limited resources is wanting to collect food and water and send them. But we realized that it would take months for this food to actually make it there. So that wasn't the most appropriate way to respond. At the same time, we started getting news through social media that, people were desperate, and especially those that actually had medical conditions that required electricity. So for example, what this says is my grandma has only 2 hours left of oxygen. She lives in Moca, a town, and we can pay for it. We just can't find it. Can you help us, please? So what happened here is we saw these type of messages repeated over and over again. Many people nowadays, if you're in oxygen therapy, you would typically connect an oxygen concentrator that gathers air, concentrates the oxygen, and feeds it back to you. That requires a lot of power to do that. In the old days, you would actually have an oxygen tank connected to you that doesn't require any power, but obviously has flammability issues and other issues associated with it. So who suffers the most when the power goes out? Well, first it's the recipients of home healthcare services, so people that are at home, that are sick, and that need power to survive. I like to actually think of these as 2 separate kinds of patients. There's the very, very critical patients, right, who their life will be threatened even if just a few days of power, if they don't have access of power for a few days. So these might be people in dialysis, people in ventilators or respirators, right, that have mechanical breathing, and then those in oxygen therapy. However, you also have lots of people that require power for less severe medical conditions whose health will deteriorate in a matter of weeks or even faster than that if they don't have power. So these are people, for example, that might suffer from asthma, might have sleep apnea, or may require medications that require refrigeration. So this is not my area of expertise. I'm a materials researcher. I work with nanomaterials like Dan mentioned. So when we started approaching this project, I felt that it was very important that we first recognize that we don't know a lot of stuff, right? So what do we not know, right? Knowing what you don't know is actually a very important thing. So what we realize is that we don't know exactly who is dependent on electricity. There are databases, and there are people that have this information available. It's just not available to us as researchers. Your insurance will know whether you receive medical therapies that require power. We don't know who can evacuate and where would they go. We don't know how much electricity is required by these people, right? How much do different conditions require in terms of power? We don't know what are the long-term effects on a community when it actually finds itself without power for months at a time. And also, we don't know how people adapt when they're faced without power to actually meet their needs. So continuing on this, we also don't know how alternatives to the grid, right, to providing electrical power, how do they perform during emergencies? This might be a diesel generator, or it might be a solar system if you're fortunate enough to have one of those in your houses, or even a microgrid, which is a newer way of thinking about how we deliver electricity to households. We don't know what are the barriers for actually implementing emergency power, and this might be social, economic, and many other kinds of barriers. And lastly, we don't know who is vulnerable. How are the vulnerabilities of a community related to the geospatial distribution of diseases, the architecture of the grid, or even the risk of a particular location to flooding and other disastrous conditions. So that's what we actually decided to focus on, trying to start to address some of these questions, hopefully. But also, the primary idea behind this project was to provide an opportunity for students, being in an educational institution, to do service and get education and growth from this experience themselves. So we focused on Huego, Puerto Rico, the hometown of my wife. And the reason is because it is remote and rural, so we anticipated that that would be one of the last places to actually recover electricity. But also the connections that we had on the ground made it very easy, or easier, to actually organize and coordinate these trips. I'd like to point out that the group's background was very varied. We had representatives from electrical engineering, chemical engineering, aerospace, civil, material science, industrial engineering, health services, and so on. All of us had different knowledge and experience and knowledge that we could contribute to the project. None of us had hands-on experiences. We can understand materials for energy, but we never worked with an actual solar cell to actually hook it up in a microgrid. So if you don't take anything else from this talk, please remember the importance of continued learning. And this is what you're doing by coming here tonight. So the schedule of the project was that we would actually meet on a weekly basis. We would coordinate the trip organization during the academic year of last year. We did then 3 different trips. The first trip was actually a scoping trip. We wanted to understand the magnitude of the problem and get an idea of what were the areas where we could actually contribute. That took place in November, just a couple of months after Hurricane Maria had actually hit the island. And you can see that the power restoration was still very low. All of the town of Huego was without power. Then the second trip was in March during spring break. And during this time, even though a lot of the island had recovered power, rural locations like Huego were still like roughly 50% power. So there were still a lot of people without power. So the objective of the second and third trip was to actually evaluate what are the possible advantages of having alternative energy systems as emergency systems for electrical outages. So here are pictures of what the students did during the first scoping trip. They interviewed patients and family members to understand their needs and their issues and difficulties. They interviewed healthcare practitioners. So here's a picture of Erin, who was from the Population Health Initiative, and fortunate to have her in the team. She was talking about vaccines and the lack of refrigeration in the clinic. And then we also installed this as part of the service component of the trip. these very small solar plus battery systems to power small refrigerators for insulin storage. This actually turned out to be much more important than we realized at the time, and it became the centerpiece for our second and third trip. So what did we find in the first trip? First, that the very sick patients, like dialysis patients, were quickly evacuated because they were recognized as being critical. However, many of them still did not make it. We also recognized that the energy insecurity definitely had an effect on the healthcare of the community. For example, all of the vaccines were wasted from the clinic, and they had completely stopped vaccinations. There were no electronic records, so it was very difficult to find out what condition or prior treatment you would have as a patient. And pharmacies were also closed, so even if you needed medication, you might not be able to get it. People with respiratory conditions were overrepresented because they weren't necessarily recognized as being critical, and they were having difficulties finding oxygen. All of these oxygen concentrators had actually displaced a lot of the original suppliers of oxygen tanks, and now they were having a hard time finding these resources. People with sleep apnea, they couldn't sleep for weeks, right? If I don't sleep one full night, I am a horrible shape the next day. I can't even imagine what it would be like to be without sleep for weeks at a time. We also recognized that there was a need for education. So for example, we saw a lot of patients that had actually stopped taking their insulin treatments out of fear that the insulin had gone bad, when in reality, insulin is actually fairly robust and can actually still remain active at room temperature for a pretty significant amount of time. The lives of all people was upended. So even if you were managing to get your treatments, that might mean that you would have to go on a 30-minute ride to the main town to actually get electricity from the clinic itself. And you might have to do this 2 or 3 times a day if you're an asthma patient. The other thing was that there was an significantly increased family cost. It actually, most people were spending on the order of $10 a day just to partially run your generator system, just to power your food in your refrigerator, a few hours at a time. That translates to around like $300 a month, when we pay typically around like $50 a month here in Seattle for a full house of the electrical use for a full house. And then the fume and the noise of the generators was also an issue. So that's what motivated a more careful look at the solar plus battery systems. So the lack of refrigeration also created problems with the diets, and many of the healthcare practitioners that we talked to recognize this as being a major issue in the long-term health of the community. So before we talk about these solar plus battery systems, it's important to think about the macro or the bigger scale of the grid and how we get power. You might be familiar with the grid, right? You know that, power is produced somewhere, and it's actually distributed across wires and eventually makes it to your house. Well, what happens if the source gets damaged or the transmissions line gets damaged? All of a sudden, everybody or large chunks of the population might be found without power. So there's an alternative to that, and that is if we actually create these things called microgrids, where there are small networks of systems of many homes, for example, that might be connected to a solar farm or a wind farm, and they also have the capacity to store some of that electricity. They can actually continue producing electricity and using it even in the case of a disaster. So even though the large grid might go down, there could still be pockets after a disaster that it can still have power. And this distribution or islanding of microgrids is what makes it advantageous in terms of resiliency for communities. So now let's shrink that down even further. So we can talk about nanogrids. So these are, you should think of this as really, really small, really small microgrids. Maybe your house, right? Your house also has consumption, production, and if you have a Tesla or some other battery system, you also have storage. So if you lose power, you can still continue using electricity because of the fact that you are self-sustaining. So the systems that we also incorporated or produced and installed and evaluated in this project are kind of like a house system, except that they're much smaller. They can only supply around like 10% of what a household in Puerto Rico would typically consume. So we had 4 different kinds of systems, and totaling around 21 different systems that we deployed in different households. Some of them were used to power these DC refrigerators that were used for insulin storage. And then we had like 3 different AC systems of different size, and they were used for different purposes. So here are the specifications. Here's the pictures of the students and the team doing the installations. Here's Mareldi from electrical engineering installing a solar panel. The students working with Marvi coordinating the next installations that they would do the next day. So they kept working from day and during the night. And it was really tough conditions. Sometimes parts would fail and we had no replacements. They had to figure out how to solder or change the parts to make it work. So what did we actually observe during these installations? One of the most interesting questions we asked the people we left the systems with was, how much do you think it actually costs? And there were great misconceptions about the cost of solar power. Many thought that this was completely outside of their economic means. They were saying tens of thousands of dollars when the systems that we provided to them were only $500 to $1,500. There was also a lack of education on basic management. People, I mean, depending on the system, whether it had lead-acid batteries or lithium-ion batteries, they required different ways of managing the battery so you wouldn't destroy it during its use. And people were asking questions like, what can I connect? Can I connect my electrical range? And the answer is no, we can't produce enough power for that kind of system. And we need a better understanding of what is a critical load. So this is an important question, and it's one that we actually inadvertently addressed by giving systems that were just too small for people to power all of their houses. So they had to choose what they actually really needed. And we learned a lot by understanding what they actually connected to that. So how were the systems used? Well, the small systems, or the smallest systems that we connected, they would typically use with a small medical device, maybe a feeding pump, or maybe a sleep apnea machine, or electrically actuated bed, for example, inflatable mattresses for bedridden patients. And they would also use them for lighting. So they were actually very, very useful, but they could only be used for limited power applications or for intermittent use, right? You don't have a lot of energy that you can actually store here. The larger and the medium-sized systems, they were used for a broader range of devices. So for example, most of the people that obtained one of these systems connected the refrigerator. They still had to manage it, right? So they would connect the refrigerator during the day when the solar system was producing power, and then they would disconnect it and keep it cold so they could maintain their food without actually rotting, and they could continue eating it. TV, we didn't expect that TV was so essential. In fact, we were anticipating sleep apnea and all of these type of devices, but if you're 6 months without communication and without connection to the world with news, a TV becomes a medical device for your mental health. And this is actually something that we didn't realize, but we understood by talking to people how important it was for them to feel connected. So there's something to be said about lithium-ion batteries versus lead-acid batteries. The low weight of the lithium-ion batteries allowed people to actually move them from room to room, and this facilitated, especially for elderly patients, the way they use the systems themselves. It also simplified management of the battery, because a lithium-ion battery you can use until you're completely exhausted, the way we use our phones, for example, whereas a lead-acid battery can only really be discharged halfway. And if you continue doing that too much, discharging too much, you can actually damage the battery and you will kill it very, very quickly. However, lithium-ion batteries can't fly on planes, and they're also much more costly. So that limits their capacity for using lithium-ion battery in response to a disaster. They weren't actually convenient for us, and we were only fortunate that there were some in place that we could buy in Puerto Rico. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to include them in our study. So what are the power consumption and uses of different medical devices? They vary broadly. There were some people that we weren't able to help because our systems just didn't have enough power to supply them. For example, if you take the oxygen concentrators, many people were using them 24/7, right? They were constantly connected to the oxygen source, and this actually consumed around like 350 watts. That's actually quite a big consumption rate. Even with a household solar system, you might be challenged running some of these oxygen concentrators. But other things like the CPAP machine, right? It had a very moderate power consumption, and this was a need that the diesel generators couldn't actually meet. Because you wouldn't run your diesel generator at night. I mean, you can't if you wanna have it last for some significant amount of time. But the solar system can run continuously, and moreover, it's not noisy, so you wouldn't get your neighbors in your face also arguing about the noise. So they varied very significantly. It was important for us to recognize and understand how do people use medical devices and power, and what are the consumption of the typical devices that they're connecting. So one of the nice features of the systems that we left was that in some of them, we could actually track the energy generated and the energy used. So here's a plot and data that was provided by Chanaka and Mareldi, both of whom were part of the team, electrical engineering students and postdocs from Daniel Kirschen's group. So you can see that in general, for most households, the power production and power consumption tracked very well with each other. They were measured with different devices. We could also see features like, for example, when did a particular family recover electricity, and also who was using more the systems than they should, and who was using it very, very modestly, and probably less than they could actually extract electricity. We could also understand about the critical load profiles. So here's for, again, also 8 actually different households, how many devices they were connecting, what was their power consumption, and how frequently they would actually be using them. So by understanding these load profiles, we can now take this information and design better suited systems for the future, which is something that we couldn't do in this particular trip because we had no data to inform the design of the systems. We had to just guess more or less based on our scoping trip findings what was actually going to be necessary. You should also notice that the y-axis, which is the power consumption of the different devices, changes broadly. So for example, this household had one of the very small systems, and they were feeding through the feeding tube the patient that was connected. And they also had an electrical bed that was actually had an inflatable mattress to prevent bed sores that are very common with bedridden patients. So with very, very minimal amount of power that was provided to this family, they were extremely ecstatic and super thankful for just any little bit of help that they could get. Fortunately, most of the systems were functional. We just had one of the systems in the second trip installations that actually was faulty. This was a commercial system, so this was out of our control. It was one of the lithium ion batteries. We found that most of the recipients, even with very limited knowledge and understanding of solar energy, could manage the systems and take care of them. We also recognized that there were large differences in the utilization of the systems. Even though we gave them all the exact same instructions, some people completely overutilized. They were extracting more power than they should have, and that was observed by the discharging more than 50% depth of discharge, which is something that can actually destroy the battery with long-term use. Whereas other families were actually underutilizing the systems and probably could actually connect more things to them and still use them properly. Largely, I mean, the main conclusion of this was that we really needed to know the load profiles to better design the systems. So we now recognize that many of the systems that we installed could have benefited from an additional solar panel, and this would have made them better balanced for the needs of those particular families. Overall, when we interviewed people after months of using the systems, we got like very positive responses. Everybody preferred solar over diesel generators. or gas generators, which are the norm in Puerto Rico for preparations for disasters. None of them had actually considered this as an alternative energy source for during a disaster. The only concern was that they did have a limited capacity in terms in comparison to a generator. So they couldn't really power the whole house like they would have when they actually ran diesel generators. Mareldi and Chanaka also did this very nice crude model to compare when is it actually, answer the question, when is it actually economically better to have a solar powered emergency system versus one of these diesel generators. And using the pricing for our systems and the typical pricing for an electrical diesel generator, you get these two charts. You would notice that the capital cost of buying a solar system is actually much higher initially, but because it has no use cost, right? You don't actually buy gasoline and no oil changes, the increase is actually very, very modest. And that would mostly be the changing of the batteries every 2 years or 3 years of use. The generator, in contrast, has a much lower initial cost and eventually has a much higher cost overall if you experience a lot of outages because of the amount of fuel that needs to be bought. So for Puerto Rico, the kind of like crossover is that if in the lifetime of one of these emergency systems, you're anticipating that you would get more than 60 or so days of power outages, then you're much better off just buying a solar system. And obviously, all of this depends on the costs and also the expected expenses, for example, for fuel. So this would change depending on locations. So how can we move forward? Well, the one thing that we can guarantee that we can say is that power outages like this will occur again. We just need to understand the connections between how power outages and health of populations are actually connected to each other. So one of the things that we did was study the literature as part of this study. And this is one article that is very relevant. This was actually data from a study that a few physicians performed right after the 2003 power outage in the Northeast. So what they did was very simply just compile who was showing up in the emergency rooms. And what you'll notice is that the same things that we found in Puerto Rico happened over there. We also they also saw a lot of representation of the oxygen patients that were desperate all of a sudden because they were found without an oxygen source. So this is not new, and we can solve this kind of problem. All we need is action. So what are the challenges for responding to some of these emergencies? Well, first, we need to continue responding with agile research after disasters. And this required resources, right? It took us still a couple of months to actually go to Puerto Rico. And that was mostly trying to find who was actually going to pay for the trips and how are we going to manage all of this, right? Coordination and so on. So it would be much faster if we were already prepared to perform this kind of research in the future. There are questions about what is the role of academic institutions in terms of contributing to research during emergencies. There's a lot of important information that needs to be gathered when disasters happen. But then what are the roles? And there are obviously safety considerations that one needs to take into account. So we want to engage students in real-world service, education, and research, and funding agencies need to support this research. Finally, we need to also acknowledge that we don't have answers for all of these questions, and we need to continue researching them. So how are we doing this moving forward? Well, data, we believe that can actually be a really powerful contributor to solving this type of problem. We have, for example, knowledge of what areas get flooded, and this is information that is compiled by FEMA in flood maps. We also have information about the electrical grid and the health disparities in geographical distribution that can be also obtained from data, for example, from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluations. So what we're trying to do is compile these different data sets to obtain a quantitative assessment of risk depending on where you live and how likely are you to experience a particular medical condition. So this is done in collaboration with Daniel Kirsten in electrical engineering and Professor Jung-Jun Cho in industrial engineering. With this information, you can then better plan for responses and for preparations, which not only affects Puerto Rico, but all of the eastern United States. So the only thing that I can guarantee you is that hurricanes will happen again. We will have power outages. Our grid structure is not going to change anytime soon. So are we going to be prepared for this or not? So what does this mean then finally for Washington State? Well, we don't get hurricanes, fortunately, here in Washington, but we do expect earthquakes, and our grid structure might also be affected by these type of disasters. Our grid is also vulnerable to weather, so we do get outages, but they're much shorter than what people experience in Puerto Rico. We have populations that are dependent on electricity, just like there are in Puerto Rico. They might be suffering from different kinds of diseases, but they all have the same power needs. So what could we do? Well, we could also advocate for changes in policies. For example, Washington has very little incentive for installing batteries. And the reason is because we don't have time of use electric billing. You actually don't have a significant economic incentive to install a battery along with your solar system. Net metering can actually give you the savings without the need to install a battery. If we had better policies to actually have a battery or to increase the amount of batteries that are installed, during emergencies we'd have more pockets of available power that can be used to help neighbors. And then we need to consider centralized grids versus microgrids. How can we actually improve resiliency by the way we deliver power to different communities? Lastly, if you are in use of one of these medical devices, or if you know people in your families that have requirements of power for health, I think it's very important that you know your loads. How much are those devices consuming? How much do you need during a day? And also to have a backup system. This is a very important thing, and here in the Northwest, we rarely prepare for that kind of disaster. So if you want more information, I encourage you to read Hurricane Maria's Deaths. They actually is a compilation of all the experiences of people that actually died, including those that suffered from electrical power outages. And also this very nice report from the National Academies. It's free, you can download it, and it talks about how we might be able to improve the resiliency of the grid by just doing important changes to the grid structure. So lastly, I want to thank everybody, including my wife, for coordinating this very rewarding project for all of us. The Clean Energy Group, who donated funds to buy the solar plus battery systems. The Clean Energy Institute, who very graciously provided the funding for travel for students to go to Puerto Rico with us. And the same for the Global Innovation Fund from the University of Washington. And many of you that also donated to this project independently, all of those resources went into directly helping people in Puerto Rico, and they contributed to this project. Thank you very much.